The new skilling boss isn't accessible for skillers, and Jagex took an L with this one. Probably the exact words of some angry redditor this week when discussing the new skilling boss. Now, not to anger the Reddit too much, I have also seen the sentiment on other socials and even in my own comments and Twitch chat, link in the description by the way. I'm live every single weekday, but do these people actually have a point? Should the new skilling boss be accessible to skillers, aka not require you to do difficult PvM, which is needed for one of the prerequisite quests to unlock this encounter, or do they need to stop complaining and accept the path they have chosen? An answer to that age-old, well, week-old question will be found in this video. Don't forget to like the video to help your boy out, subscribe if you're new as we're trying to get to 10k subs by the end of 2025, and to be honest, you don't want to miss any of my Gate of Elidinis content, but enough waffling, my name's Chevalric, and let's talk about it. Okay, so let's break this one down. What is the issue at hand? Well, some people are upset that the new skilling boss, the Gate of Elidinis, is quote, locked behind PvM and in their eyes, difficult PvM content, which in a way it is due to the prerequisite quest requiring you to take on Vorkath in a story mode encounter. They argue that a skilling boss should be accessible to skillers. But what does that even mean? I'm a skiller, but I also do PvM. Well, what I think they mean is that it should be accessible to skiller pures, people who don't do any combat, and for ease of conversation here, when I mention skillers, I'll be grouping both skill pures and or people in general who don't do combat at all in whatever shape or form together. And sometimes skillers are also people who choose not to do combat because they either don't enjoy it or they simply just suck at it but still do have their combat stats level. As an example, Croesus doesn't have any hard requirements at all, which they, the skillers, give as an example of how a skilling boss should be, but I think that boss is actually part of the issue, but we will get to that. Whatever your stance on this argument is, it does raise a very interesting point. Should this boss be accessible to skillers and not require you to do any combat to unlock it? It's quote, a skilling boss after all. And I think honestly, that is where the first misunderstanding lies. People assume that a skilling boss is made for skillers. But in essence, if you break it down, a skilling boss is a boss you defeat using your skills. Croesus is defeated by the use of mining, fishing, woodcutting, hunting, and construction. Wintertodt in old school Runescape is defeated by the use of fire making and a bit of construction, fletching, and herblore. Tempro is defeated by the use of fishing, cooking, and a bit of construction. I think you get the point here. A skilling boss is not by design a boss made for skillers, but instead a boss made to be defeated using your skills. Now, you could argue that the target audience of such a boss are people who overall are less skilled in PvM or don't do PvM at all, which I agree with to an extent. As in general, in either game, skilling bosses aren't as difficult mechanically as PvM encounters. It usually requires you to do a set amount of actions like repairing, gathering and depositing versus things like movement, prayers, eating, dodging mechanics, damage and defensive that you do at PvM encounters. So why does it need the completion of a quest that requires you to do these mentioned PvM actions in the Battle of 4 and 3 yet again, as you'll be required to defeat a story mode version of Vorkath? To the people raising the old school RuneScape argument of their skilling bosses aren't locked behind a difficult quest fight, yes, one actually is, and his name is Volcano, or her name is Volcano, which requires you to unlock Prifddinas and survive the rather difficult Saren boss fight. Volcano is actually a perfect example and segue into my next argument as well. Remember how I mentioned Croesus being a part of the problem earlier? It is. But to understand this, we need to look at the design philosophy of any bossing encounter in general, and I think we can break that down into 3 factors: entry requirements, boss difficulty, and rewards. As we established, the difficulty of most skilling bosses aren't that high. Even if you struggle at Croesus now, it really comes down to collecting resources, dodging the mechanics, and taking down the boss. The hardest part is finding a group to teach you it, as overall messes kind of suck. The same can be said for the Gate of Elidinis. It's not that difficult when you break it down, or even the old school RuneScape skilling bosses for that matter. I know it might sound backwards, but let's focus on the third part of the puzzle here. The rewards, which can either be XP or GP. In the case of bosses like Wintertodt and Tempros, we're talking about experience, as the loot overall is quite mediocre to pretty bad. They aren't money makers, but more so alternative training methods that give you some loot. But Croesus is a moneymaker, as the experience there is okay, but the loot is actually really good. It's actually still ranking in the top 20 moneymakers in the game overall as of me writing this video, and it used to be even better when magic was the meta with Crypt Bloom and Animate Dead. A unique at Croesus used to average around 300 to 400 million GP, and they aren't that rare to get either. Now that brings us to the key part of this discussion and the mistake made with Croesus. The first part of the puzzle, the entry requirements. To go back to our old school Runescape comparison, Wintertodt and Temporals don't have high entry requirements, are decent trading methods, and are not too great for loot. As you might have noticed, I didn't mention Solgano there, as it is locked behind a Grandmaster quest with a tough boss fight, steep entry requirements. But it's actually a really good moneymaker, as it can net you a tidy 2 million profit an hour, which is pretty decent for old school Runescape standards. Croesus is good money, not that difficult of a boss fight, and has low-ish entry requirements in the sense that, sure, you might want at least level 80 in one of the stats required to kill the boss, but with modern experience rates, that is rather accessible. To properly balance a boss, in my opinion, the loot should reflect the difficulty of either the fight or the entry requirements. As we established, making the skilling boss difficult defeats the purpose, so the only way to solve this issue is to make the entry requirements more steep. Croesus is by design a poorly balanced boss, in my opinion, as it's too accessible for people and the loot it gives is too expensive for what it required to be done. So what they did with the new skilling boss, from my point of view, is make the requirements a lot higher to justify the loot of the boss actually being good. Now obviously, at the time of me making this video, we don't know what the drop prices will settle at. But if the GP an hour is somewhat similar to Croesus, then it would be properly balanced. Am I arguing that they should retroactively nerf Croesus? Absolutely not. The damage has been done, the boss has been out for too long, there's no point anymore. But it is something they clearly learned from, and rightfully so in my opinion, as Croesus is just too accessible of a boss, requirement wise, to be making such insane amount of profits. To give you some perspective, Croesus's hourly profits are on par with bosses like Raksha or low in rage Zamorak, which have a lot higher entry requirements than Croesus does when it comes to gear and even general skill. So should a skilling boss be accessible for skillers? Yes. But only if it doesn't give ridiculous amounts of profits with barely any entry requirements. If Jagex wants to make these skilling bosses good money makers, then they have to put some more steep requirements to be able to take these encounters on. And sure, maybe they should have gone for a different route with their second skilling boss. Create a RuneScape 3 version of Wintertodt, a very decent training method with some okay-ish loot. But they didn't. But what do you think? Check out my overview of the new skilling boss on screen, like the video if you did enjoy, and my name's Chevalric, and I'll see you guys in my next video.